Welcome, all pregnant families, midwives or birth workers. This is Tracy Anderson-Askew, your host for the Transform Your Birth podcast, changing your mind about birth one story at a time. Each week we will be exploring a birth story through the lens of what birth can teach us. I'll be digging deep into each story so you can learn what it is that can change the way a birth unfolds. We can't control birth, but we can influence it. So listen in to find out how. Enjoy. Dr. Sarah Buckley is trained as a GP family physician with further qualifications in GP-obstetrics and family planning. She is the mother of 4 adult children, all born at home, and lives in Brisbane, Australia. She is the author of Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering and Hormonal Physiology of Childbearing. Dr. Buckley has been writing and lecturing in pregnancy, birth and parenting since 1997 and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, where her research is focused on oxytocin in labour and birth and the impacts of interventions. Dr. Buckley's work critiques current practices in pregnancy, birth and parenting from the widest possible perspectives, including scientific, anthropological, cross-cultural, psychological, and the personal. Today, Sarah talks to us extensively about the hormone of oxytocin during labour, breastfeeding, and parenting. Our talk reminded me of the intricacies of Mother Nature's blueprint and just how well she has set us up for birth and parenting. It did leave me wondering, when we interfere with birth, at what cost? She encourages us to be fully informed in our decision-making, to listen to our hearts and our intuition, and to claim our rightful role as the real experts in our bodies and our children. This episode is dense in detail and yet left me feeling in awe of the human journey of reproduction. Enjoy.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. This episode has been brought to you by Transform Parenting, an organisation that provides courses, coaching and community from pregnancy through to the first 7 years of a child's life. Most of the stories you will hear through this podcast are graduates of the Transform Your Birth workshop held in Canberra. Our Transform Your Birth Today course is now available to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and includes all the wonderful wisdom of this course and live weekly catch-ups when you need it with our host, Tracy. For a little taste, please accept our pregnancy gift offer, which contains free the first few lessons and some essential wisdom for pregnancy. The link can be found in these show notes or visit transformyourbirth.com.au. And now for the episode.
Hello everyone. Welcome again to the Transform Your Birth podcast. And when I first started this podcast, one of the first people on my hit list was the woman I have with you today. Her name's Sarah Buckley. I have followed Sarah's work for a long, long time, and she's offered so much in this world of birth, parenting and health professionals. So it's lovely to have you with me today, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. Now, the topic we're going to look at today are the hormones of labour, but actually more specifically we're going to look at oxytocin. In previous episodes, we've talked a lot about the optimization of these powerful, feel-good, performance-enhancing hormones. And sometimes we can forget or underestimate the power of what we have in our own bodies' biochemistry or our own body's pharmacy, because there's nothing more powerful in a bottle that comes even close to the body's own biochemistry. And Sarah's going to really help us understand that today. So, Sarah, can you just give the listeners a little bit of an idea as to how you got interested in this field in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Well, I come from a long line of medical professionals, but also people involved in birth. So my grandfather was actually a old school GP, like family physician, in a small town in New Zealand, and he would go out on horseback and attend women giving birth in the bush. We've got a family story about him not coming back for 2 days, and my grandmother said, "Oh, don't worry, he'll come back."
Oh, wow.
My father was actually an obstetrician, and then on my other side, my mother's grandmother was a granny midwife in a different part of New Zealand, and she attended the births of my mother and her siblings. So it's kind of on both sides. I was always interested in birth myself, but I also brought a kind of alternative, trust in nature perspective to it, so that when I had my babies myself, I chose to have them at home. And my husband's also a medical doctor, so it was a bit unusual for us to make that choice. We've both actually done training, GP obstetric training in a small hospital in New Zealand. And personally, I observed that the women that had the best time were the women who gave birth at night when not many people were around. And we'd also had the privilege of supporting two friends having babies at home. And, we had that experience. Oh, this is what hospital birth is. This is what home birth is. Like, home birth really seemed like the best option. And on top of that, my husband's sister, Sue Lennox, is a home birth midwife of 40 years now in New Zealand. So we were very influenced by all of those things. And, we were very lucky living in Melbourne. We had options. There were lots of midwives. We actually had a GP, Peter Lucas, come to our births, because at the first time I was, I had all that training and all that experience. I thought, oh my God, what happens if my baby can't breathe after birth and she needs intubating? So that was my medical concern. And so I have a doctor there who could intubate her in case she needed intubating. Of course, that's not actually necessary. There's all kinds of things that can be done short of that. But, you've got to cover your own fears. And, I was very lucky to have all of my babies at home for one reason or another. And I could compare what would have happened if I'd been in hospital. Like, my first baby was actually 36 and a half weeks, and I would have been, I would have been high risk. I would have been kicked out of any birth centre. She would have been separated under the lights, all kinds of things. So, I can really see how beneficial to my own physiology and to the relationship I built, especially with Emma, in choosing to have my baby at home. And just one more thing to say about home birth, a little plug for home birth. It's not actually having the home birth that gives you the advantage. It's actually choosing the home birth, because that reduces all of your risk, like cesarean, like 10% or so with home birth versus 30 to 40% in hospital. So yeah, I'm a big fan of home birth. But I also, as we'll talk about, the most important thing is to choose to give birth somewhere where you feel safe. So wherever you feel safe, that's the best place for you. And we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, that's certainly, it's the place where birth isn't disturbed and often not overly observed either, in terms of women feeling like they're under the spotlight. So it's a beautiful option, and we've got many stories of home births. I was teaching on the weekend and I had two midwives in my class, both having home births. So, for health professionals to feel confident to give birth at home, it's certainly something worth considering when you're making these types of choices. Now, Sarah, you're doing your PhD on oxytocin in labour and the impacts of intervention on that. Oxytocin is pretty much the big kahuna of the hormones when it comes to labour and birth and bonding, and it has so many beautiful qualities to it. Tell us how, what was the thinking behind doing a PhD on that, and what can you tell us about oxytocin?
Yes, well, it's interesting because going back to my first birth, I was living in a small cottage in Richmond, inner city Melbourne, and my neighbour had three children. And when I was pregnant, she was really helpful to me and lent me like a bassinet, and I set up the nursery. And I had a very short and sweet, I call it sweet and oceanic. You can read it in my book, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering, Birth at Home. And the feeling I had was that before the birth, I was going to mother in this particular way. And I could literally feel my brain change through that 5 hours of labour. And once I held my baby in my arms, like, no way would I have her more than like an arm's length away. And I thought, what happened to my brain? So kind of my search has been like, what happened to my brain? What happens to the brain in labour? And I really discovered that when I started doing research around the hormones. Particularly, I wrote a big report called Hormonal Physiology of Childbirth. And then what I discovered in writing that report was that we really don't know a lot about all these things. And so I decided to do a PhD, and I was incredibly privileged to meet with a woman at a conference called Professor Kirsten Uvnas-Moberg, who's a world expert on oxytocin and childbirth. And she invited me to join her group of European researchers. So it was kind of happenstance. It was a lifelong curiosity, or a mother-long curiosity. And then what we've been doing in the PhD work, it was initially actually funded by a European grant, was doing systematic reviews of oxytocin levels in the blood during physiological birth, during breastfeeding, and then with interventions, which is what I'm writing at the moment. So what that means is that we use a systematic methodology to find all the studies that have been published in any particular area. So in this case, all the studies that have measured actual oxytocin levels in the blood of labouring women, of newborn babies in some of these areas, we could find that as well. And then what happens in physiological labour and birth, what happens during breastfeeding actually, and then also what happens when you bring in interventions. So we've published a paper on synthetic oxytocin. I've got one that's under review at the moment about cesareans, and the one I'm writing, hope to submit in the next coming weeks, is on epidurals and opioids. So what do all those things do to oxytocin levels? And it's great research because it's very concrete. Like, we can have all kinds of ideas, but this is actually what's measured in the bloodstream. So it's very factual, it's very evidence-based. And then because we're looking at a multitude of studies, we can actually make authoritative statements about it. So yeah, and what I came to understand was a whole lot of things about oxytocin that I hadn't really known before I started doing this research and working with this group, and particularly with Professor Ugnas Moberg. So oxytocin is, as you say, our favourite birthing hormone, and oxy fast tocin birth. So it was first discovered, or the molecule was discovered as something that makes birth go fast. And in fact, my father, when he first trained as an obstetrician, they actually used pituitary extracts because oxytocin's stored in the pituitary, and they figured if you use pituitary extracts, you could actually give them to women and stop postpartum hemorrhage. That was the first use of it. It was called pituitrin. And then they refined that, and now it's actually a synthetic version of oxytocin that's used, called syntocinon, different names, Pitocin in the US. So we'll talk more about that. But basically, it's the same molecule as what we make. But the important thing to know is that we make it inside our brain. So it's made in the deep recesses of the brain called the hypothalamus, and then it's stored downstream in the pituitary, and then it's released from the pituitary in a number of circumstances, but specifically during labour and birth. It's released in pulses, which is actually a bit unusual, and it's also released in pulses during breastfeeding. So the pulses go from the pituitary gland into the bloodstream, get down to the uterus, and when they get to the uterus, they cause the rhythmic, or they facilitate the rhythmic contractions of labour. And the way they do that is they bind, every hormone works by binding to a specific receptor. And I say it's like a key and a lock. So oxytocin, the hormone, the oxytocin receptor is the lock. So when oxytocin from the brain goes down to the uterus, it finds the receptors on the outside of the uterine muscle cells. It binds to those receptors, and it's like turning the key. It sends a chemical message into the cell saying contract. And what we found, especially in the first paper, the paper on physiological childbirth, was that the oxytocin levels at the beginning of spontaneous labour actually not very high. And that was very interesting. In fact, they're not very high all the way through. We'll come back to that point. But they're not very high. They're equivalent for any health professionals listening to about 2 to 4 milliunits of synthetic oxytocin per minute. So quite a low levels. But the reason that they are so low is because the uterus is so sensitive to oxytocin, because there's a dramatic increase, like about almost 1,000 times more oxytocin receptors at the beginning of labour compared to non-pregnant women. So the human uterus is exquisitely sensitive to oxytocin. So we don't need very much to cause those contractions of labour and to cause an efficient labour and birth. That's a really important point. And I'm just going to go back to something you mentioned at the start, which was about how women need to feel private and unobserved in labour, right? So, one perspective I use, I actually studied anthropology in my university days. So if we take like an anthropological or evolutionary perspective, we could say that, humans, we're mammals, we have mammary glands, we suckle our youngs, and we're placental mammals. Specifically, we give birth to large live young with placentas as opposed to marsupials. So placental mammals have been around for about 65 million years. So almost all of that time we've given birth in the wild, like our mammalian cousins. And any female giving birth in the wild has to be so sensitive to her surroundings. Is she in a safe place? Is she going to survive the birth? Or a baby's going to survive the birth? Are there any predators nearby? Are there strange noises, strange smells? Like, she's kind of on high alert, right? Which is why every labouring female, including women, seek a place that's private, safe and unobserved to give birth. And, first-time mamas, it's typical. You find the smallest room you can in the toilet or the shower, right?
Yeah.
because your system is actually the most sensitive. So that feeling of private, safe, and unobserved is really important. But the other point is that in the wild, the duration of labor is the duration of risk. Yeah. So a long labor, if a female was in labor for 12 hours, she probably wouldn't survive. Like her baby wouldn't survive. She'd be taken by a predator. So we're designed to have an effective and efficient labor and birth. So that increase in oxytocin receptors is part of that. So that means that at the onset of labor, the uterus is as sensitive as possible. The contractions will be as efficient as possible. The pushing stage, we'll get to that later, will be as efficient as possible. And just by the way, it's not just about oxytocin receptors. There's a whole lot of preparations that happen to ensure the effectiveness of labor and birth. There's like inflammation happening. There's like the uterus gets kind of wired up for efficient contractions. There's softening of the cervix. There's prostaglandins. There's a whole lot of other factors, to be honest, Tracy. We don't actually even understand it. Like if I could tell you what caused the spontaneous onset of labor, I'd get a Nobel Prize, because we don't know for sure that it's this thing and not the other thing. We do know that it's a whole complex system. And the other thing I want to say is that this complex system ensures that the readiness of the mother and the readiness of the baby are coordinated, because the mother has to be ready for this effective, efficient labor and birthright. But the baby also has to be ready for the travail, the intensity, the challenges of labor and birth, which we'll get to discuss later on, but also for life outside the womb. So the baby has to be ready and the mother has to be ready for survival, which is not just individual survival, it's species survival, right, on an evolutionary sense. So there's these cross communications that happen across the placenta between the mother and the baby to ensure that both are perfectly ready at exactly the same time. So that's physiological onset of labor. Everything's all ready to go. It's hard to do this research in humans, but in animals, it's not just oxytocin in the uterus, it's oxytocin receptors in the brain. That means that the brain's ready for a whole lot of things that happen there during labor and birth. We'll talk about that as well. And also that the system is going to adapt afterwards as well. You know, all the postpartum changes, the newborn transition, the mother's, needs a good oxytocin system to stop her from bleeding afterwards as well. So all of those things are actually set up before the onset of labor. And we kind of, in our culture, we think, it doesn't matter if we induce someone a week early, but all those changes, they haven't been completed. Like if you haven't gone into labor spontaneously, you're not at the full state of readiness. Your baby isn't at the full state of readiness either, by definition. So I'm sure we'll talk about induction later, but I'll go on and talk about the brain in a minute. But just, is there anything you want to comment on that or ask?
No, I just think what you're describing, and this is what we don't always hear about, and I'm really loving this conversation, is you're describing this intricate, evolved over however long we've existed, system of support. We're not just a walking uterus. We've got a whole lot of other things going on, not just to help this baby arrive, but to prepare us for that other side. I just think it's incredible what you're talking about. Can you help us to understand how we interfere with that?
Yeah, well, I just want to talk about the brain for a minute, and then we'll get on to that. So again, if we talk about all mammals, like mammals, we have mammary glands with suckle our young. So common to all mammals is this period of dependence of the baby on the mother, primarily. In some cases, the father's involved, but mostly the mother, 95% of species. So this period of dependence presumes that the mother will take care of the babies, not just produce young, not just lactate or breastfeed, as we say in humans, but also will defend the young, which we would call bonding in humans as well, right? So all of these things are not random. They are actually designed to happen, and they're designed to happen as soon as the baby's born, right? So if any mammal gave birth, successfully, and the baby survived, and even if she could suckle her young, but she wasn't taking care of the babies, if she just walked away and wasn't prepared to defend them, like a mother bear, for example, with all her claws, the babies wouldn't survive. So, what I say is that birth and breastfeeding and bonding are all part of one system, which is designed for optimal survival of the species, and they're all hardwired into us as women as well. And also that will work through the system of oxytocin. So the way that oxytocin works to facilitate this is, remember I said it's released, it's made in the hypothalamus, stored in the pituitary, released into the blood. Well, at the same time, it's also released into the brain. So if you know oxytocin is like the hormone of love, like a feel-good hormone, you're really talking about its effects in the brain. So at the same time in labor and birth that we release it into the body, it's released into the brain as well. And that central is another word for brain release, means that inside the brain it has calming effects. So specifically oxytocin reduces activity, we say down regulates the whole stress system. It reduces cortisol, it reduces adrenaline, reduces noradrenaline, reduces AVP. All of the stress hormones get down regulated through oxytocin release in the brain. So it's helping the labouring female to be as calm as possible. And this is really important. I mean, imagine a mammal that's never given birth before, like what the heck is happening here, right? We don't want it to run away or become aversive. Like we want that calming, soothing, and actually pain relieving as well. So in the brain, oxytocin activates a whole lot of opioid pain relieving mechanisms as well. So calming, pain relieving. And at the same time, what oxytocin is doing in the brain during labor and birth is activating the reward and pleasure centers. And this is why it's a feel-good hormone, right? Because it makes us feel good through dopamine release in the mesocorticolimbic dopamine pathways. But specifically in labor and birth, those are getting activated so that when the mammalian mother meets her baby or babies for the first time, she's got this full-on activation of reward and pleasure centers. Then she gets the sensory input from her babies, like the sight of them, the feel of them, the smell of them, the taste of them. Most mammals lick their babies. And that gets what we say fired and wired, connected up in the brain with the reward and pleasure centers. And that means from the very beginning, the babies are a source of reward and pleasure for her. So she'll be rewarded and motivated to give the dedicated care that every mammalian newborn needs, including humans. Of course, we have the longest period of dependence. So there's no reason to think that this system doesn't happen in women as well, this maximum activation of the pleasure and reward centers. And I'm sure you've heard women say, oh my God, that was so good, I could do that again. Like if it goes really well, that's how it feels. You get this maximum activation of pleasure and reward centers. And there's another couple of things that happen. And these are happening, remember, in physiological birth. And they're actually happening through the peaks of oxytocin that happen in the brain at the end of labor. So as we found in our first systematic review, labor oxytocin levels start low, become bigger and bigger, but it's kind of hard to measure because, well, there's technical reasons, but also because it's released in pulses, as I said. So if you measure right now, you might get the trough of the pulse or the peak of the pulse. So, and it's hard to strap down a woman in late labor, right, to measure oxytocin pulses. So probably we don't even know what they are, but they're probably, several hundreds, or at least hundreds times higher than what we can measure. And this has actually been measured during breastfeeding and probably fairly similar. So these peaks, these high peaks that happen, and we're only measuring the blood, which is a long way from the brain, right? So they're probably much, much higher in the brain, and they're switching on all of these systems, including like reward and pleasure centers, but also including the activation of what's called in other species the maternal circuits, the caretaking behaviors, the species-specific things that animals do. Like in rats, they pick up their babies and move them, and then they have a arch back nursing. They arch their back into a C shape so they're available to suckle the baby. So all of these kind of specific maternal behaviors for the species also get switched on by those enormous pulses, levels of oxytocin in the brain at the end of labor. And what we know in humans is that these cause a change in personality. So when women have been through physiological birth, they become more relaxed, less tense, more sociable, all kind of oxytocin effects that are going to optimize and benefit their mothering. And the last thing that we found in our research was that these peaks of oxytocin, probably those late labor peaks, switch on the mother's skin sensitivity so that when she has her baby in skin-to-skin contact with her straight after birth, she releases a lot of oxytocin. I'm sure all the listeners have heard of the magic of skin-to-skin, right? So, you keep your baby warm and, all kinds of things happen. You warm your baby up. It's much warmer. The skin-to-skin newborn is much warmer than anything we can put on the baby or put the baby under, all of those things, because the mother's body literally pulses heat to the baby. But this only happens when women have been through labor and birth. It doesn't happen in women who've been through a pre-labor cesarean, according to the research that we reviewed. So no significant increase in oxytocin in that circumstance. So physiological labor and birth activates the reward and pleasure centers, switches on maternal behaviors in all mammals, and in humans that seems to look like personality changes. And then it also turns on that oxytocin released with skin-to-skin contact. And in fact, what can happen is, because oxytocin also, remember I said it's an anti-stress hormone. So what it does is it turns down the stress system, which is the sympathetic fight or flight system, and turns up the opposite, which is the parasympathetic. And one effect of that is to cause warming of the skin. We call it vasodilation, opening up of the blood vessels in the skin. So someone who's under the influence of oxytocin is literally a warmer person. Yeah, they're not cold, they're warm. Yeah. And this happens postpartum as well. And it's interesting, like I was looking at pictures of myself or any woman postpartum, often she has those flushed cheeks, and she can even have a flush that goes from the chest right up to the face. And that's that vasodilation that's got to keep her newborn baby. Well, we can also get this with sexual activity, actually, sexual arousal. Yeah. So it's a beautiful flush, it's a beautiful warmth, but it's there to basically save the life of the baby who's just come out of this warm atmosphere. They're wet, they would get cold easily, but skin to skin on the mother, the mother's body heat and the mother pulsing heat following physiological birth, will keep her baby warm. And in those circumstances, after physiological birth, this is another study we reviewed, the mother's oxytocin levels, remember I said from early labor to late labor, as I said, it's average. We don't get the peaks, but it's 3 to 4 times higher. But in that hour after birth, it can go even 10 times higher than what it was at birth, because the mother's skin is so sensitive to her baby's touch. And then she releases oxytocin, and that causes the vasodilation, the warming up, the pulsing of heat to her baby. And that happens following physiological labor and birth. So all these adaptations happen. And there's always one more thing to say, but that activation of pleasure and reward centers seems to have an ongoing effect. And this is actually a study, a cesarean study. So they've got women who'd had a cesarean, a pre-labor cesarean, so no labor and birth, no pre-labor preparations. And they also got women who'd been through a normal labor and birth, and they put them into an MRI machine 2 to 4 weeks after birth, and they played them the sound of their baby crying. And they found that when women had been through physiological labor and birth, these parts of the brain that we could predict got activated, the pleasure and reward centers, the alertness centers, this is my baby, I need to do something, empathy centers. And those things didn't happen to the same extent when women had been through a pre-labor cesarean without that activation of the pleasure and reward centers. So, there's something that happens there that if it doesn't happen, there's a hormonal gap, as I call it. So, it has an ongoing effect. And whether it's a kind of it's changing the structure of the brain, it probably is to some extent, because, mothers who've had babies before, often the maternal behaviors kick in more easily. Breastfeeding happens more easily. Labor and birth happens more easily. The structure of the brain changes. But also there's the thing is also fueled and continued by interactions, by rewarding interactions between the mother and the baby. Because, of course, every time we suckle our babies, every time we breastfeed, we release oxytocin in the brain. That's reinforcing all of these maternal adaptations, as we call them, as well. And all of these things in the postpartum period will add up to, in fact, that warmth of the mother we think is very important, because when the baby comes onto the chest of that warm mother, the baby can relax, the baby can let go of the birth stress, the baby knows it's in the right place to start to enact the breast crawl and the breast-seeking behavior. And in fact, in that study that I just quoted, where women didn't release oxytocin with the pre-labor cesarean, those babies cried more on that when they were actually on skin to skin with the mother than in this study with the father. And I think it was like, what's going on here? Like this is meant to be a warm body I'm coming onto, and it's not as warm as it should be. There's a hormonal gap that I think the baby was picking up as well. So,
wow, that's a lot. And it's so intricate, isn't it? And so extensive and far reaching. So Sarah, tell us how do we interfere with that?
Yes, well, as some of those things I've just mentioned, if we start off with a pre-labor cesarean, well, as I've mentioned, by definition, mother and baby aren't fully ready because they haven't gone into labor. So there's not those pre-labor preparations. There's not the in-labor processes. So there's really big, as I call them, hormonal gaps there for the mother and for the baby, right? And often the baby after a pre-labor cesarean is just not quite awake. A baby that's been through physiological labor and birth, I haven't talked about this, but they get a full activation of their stress system. It's called the good stress of being born. In fact, their adrenaline and noradrenaline levels are so high they cause a stroke in an adult. That's exactly what the baby needs to survive and thrive in those challenges of labour. I'll just go back a step and say what those challenges are. So the challenges of labour for the baby are the rhythmic contractions of labour, because each contraction squeezes the placenta, which is the baby's lifeline, right? And if you squeeze the placenta hard enough, it's going to cut off blood supply to the baby. So for the peak of that contraction, the baby's going to be deprived of blood and oxygen. But human babies or mammalian babies through 65 million years of mammalian evolution have got these adaptations to survive that. In fact, not just to survive, but to thrive. That stress seems to be necessary to switch on a whole lot of adaptations for the baby, so that these high levels of stress hormones actually shift blood and make sure the baby's brain and heart are always well supplied with blood and oxygen. They also prepare the lungs to breathe outside the womb. The first thing that has to happen for the baby, right, is open up the airways, increase lung surfactant, which is the lung lubricant, a whole lot of other things. So the good stress of being born is really important for the baby. So a pre-labor cesarean baby doesn't have any of that good stress of being born. So often they're kind of a bit sleepy, a bit dozy. I say it's a bit like the experience for the baby is a bit like, we're lying in bed at night and we're all cozy and snug and it's cold outside, and then someone rips off the blankets and shines this bright light in our eyes and we're just not ready to wake up right. So that's what it is for the pre-labor cesarean baby. And then for the mother, as I said, she's had none of those preparations, and she's kind of, thrown into mothering in a way that biology, that evolution has not helped her. She hasn't got that help, those maternal adaptations. So that's the most extreme hormonal gap, we could say. And we'll talk in a minute about how to address those hormonal gaps. So that's the biggest one. But an in-labor cesarean depends a bit whether the mother's been induced or not. If she's been induced, then she and her baby are not ready either. But also, to some extent, depending on when the cesarean's done, she's going to miss out on the contractions of labour, the oxytocin release. The baby's going to miss out on all those good stress of being born. In fact, one study that we reviewed found that even with the in-labour cesarean, the mother still didn't have those full personality changes that we talked about. So we think it's probably those last peaks of labour, those full, huge, unmeasurable levels in the brain that cause these adaptations that happen. So in labour cesarean, less of a hormonal gap than a pre-labour cesarean, but still there's some hormonal gap there. And then there's induction, of course, which by definition, as I said, the mother isn't fully ready, the baby isn't fully ready. We don't even understand a whole lot of those things, including what are the impacts on breastfeeding and bonding. Those studies haven't been done, right? We can come back and talk about the ARRIVE trial or those kind of things if you like. But yeah, so we don't really know enough about the impacts of induction on mothers and babies. We know that you've got to give more synthetic oxytocin when someone's induced because their system isn't ready, which could be predicted from everything I've said. So induction, the other thing is synthetic oxytocin. So that was one of the studies that we did, was looking at oxytocin levels in women and babies when women are administered synthetic oxytocin in labour. And the surprising and kind of reassuring thing in some ways was that the levels aren't really that high. And just coming back to what I said in the beginning, that the uterus is so sensitive to oxytocin that you can't give a labouring woman very much of it. Otherwise, she's going to cause huge contractions and endanger her baby, right? So you can't give, in labour, the full duration of labour, for example, we might give average like 2 or 3 units in total, maybe maximum, 10 or 15 for a long labour. Outside of labour, there's studies on oxytocin, you can give 80 units, it's no problem. But as I said, the doses are very moderate. You can't give that dose in labour. So that means that you can't get very high blood levels in labour. You don't need very high blood levels, yeah. So what we found was that the levels in women who administered synthetic oxytocin were like 2 to 3 times normal. And that's not high enough, for example, to cross the placenta to the baby. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It's not high enough to cross to the mother's brain. And anyway, the mother's brain's making heaps of it. And the baby, we also found in these studies, is making even more oxytocin than the mother. The baby's levels at birth are even higher than the mother. So the baby is helping the baby with the stress of labour. It's calming, pain relieving for the baby. It's probably triggered by both the contractions of labour, like almost like a skin massage kind of effect, because stimulating the skin releases oxytocin, but also the stress of labour, or that hypoxic low oxygen stress that we talked about, also stimulates oxytocin. And oxytocin helps to kind of counteract the stress. And the way that I describe it, I say that in labor for both the mother and the baby that the stress system is maximally activated, because these are intense, stressful experiences, right? So for the baby, adrenaline, noradrenaline; for the mother, cortisol, stress, pain, all of those things. But also to help both of them, the anti-stress system is maximally activated. So that's oxytocin. So the oxytocin system is helping to counter that, right? Mm-hmm. So you get both of those things for the baby as well. And that they actually continue after birth. And the baby has this window that you might have learned about in hospitals, for example, that the baby has this window of pain relief, natural analgesia. Sometimes if they're going to do painful things to babies, they do them in that first hour or two after birth. The baby has this natural analgesia, which comes from the high oxytocin peaks in labor and birth. So going back to synthetic oxytocin, we don't think it impacts the baby's brain. We don't think it impacts the mother's brain. We don't think it causes autism. And there's actually, without wanting to confuse people, when there's low doses of it, it even seems like it could have some benefits. But I'm just going to go back a step and explain something else. So remember I said oxytocin is released from the brain into the body, right? So oxytocin is a simple molecule, a peptide molecule. It's not fat soluble. It doesn't easily cross biological membranes, which are fatty. Yeah. So it goes from the body, the brain into the body through a specific pathway, the portal circulation, but it doesn't easily cross from the body back to the brain. About 1,000th of it crosses these biological membranes. So the levels aren't that high in labor, even with synthetic oxytocin. So that's not high enough to cross to the mother's brain and have a significant impact. It's not high enough to cross to the baby. And as I said, anyway, the baby's making oxytocin and the placenta is full of enzymes that break down oxytocin. So we really don't think that this is a significant concern, crossing to the mother, crossing to the baby, directly causing negative effects. Of course, it does increase stress for the baby. And the reason for this, and again, if I'm referring you to the synthetic oxytocin paper we wrote, so the baby is adapted to these periods of low oxygen, hypoxia in labor, and then the baby gets a contraction, blood and oxygen levels are low, the baby's under the stress, and then the contraction ceases. The baby has this period of rest and replenishment. The period between contractions is very important for the baby, so that the baby can replenish the blood and oxygen, and then another contraction. So the problem with synthetic oxytocin from a physiological point of view is that it reduces the period between contractions, the period for replenishment for the baby. And some babies can cope with that, some babies can't. So some babies can get progressively more and more and more, we say hypoxic, more and more challenged by this low oxygen levels. And that's the risk, is it does increase risks for the baby. And I say to women, if you're offered an intervention and they've got to monitor you, you know there's risks for your baby, and that's synthetic oxytocin, right? It's monitored because there's risks to the baby. For the mother as well.
Can I just come in there, Sarah? It's an important thing if you are going down the path of induction to appreciate what Sarah's saying, and to actually instruct your caregivers how you're wanting to approach this. And that is to make sure that whatever they administer when it comes to the synthetic oxytocin, that as best as possible it mimics a normal labour, rather than going up the Richter scale too quick with contractions too close together, because that replenishment is really important for the safety of the baby. And we know that inductions are more likely to lead to the need for a caesarean because the baby's distressed. So these are things, every woman will have a different metabolic response to how that, influences her contractions. But it's a really important point there that Sarah's making around the safety of the baby being able to continue to replenish that oxygen supply.
Yes, and what you say that every woman has a different response, that's really important too, because we can't predict what anyone's response is going to be. No. So it really is like medicine, a therapeutic trial. So starting, and when we looked at these papers, the older studies started the lowest dose and only raised the doses by a small amount, like up to 40 minutes to an hour. And some of the modern regimes started higher doses, like they double the dose, they do them every 20 minutes. And that is, that's overworking the uterus, that's overstressing the baby. And just one more thing to say that when you talk about mimicking physiological labor and birth. So in these studies, what we found was, particularly in this one particular study, they found that the levels during labor and birth were around about the same levels as under 9 milliunits per minute. It's quite a low dose. So if you want to your labour and birth to kind of mimic physiological with synthetic oxytocin, then you want to stay under 9 or 10 if that's possible. And going slowly, giving your uterus time to respond, because the other opposite, we talked about the problems for the baby. Well, the problems for the mother is you're basically overworking her uterus. It's like you go for a long run and your muscles are overworked and they get tired and they build up lactic acid and they get more painful and then they don't contract so well. So, it's not good to overwork the uterus either.
No, that's important. So when it comes to women being in labour and really wanting to optimise oxytocin, what can they do?
I'm just going to say one more thing, Tracy, I haven't mentioned, which is epidural. So we haven't said that, and I need to say that because I'm working on it at the moment. So epidurals is a great option in some ways because it's very effective at abolishing pain. But the problem, that is also the problem with epidurals, and I haven't mentioned the oxytocin feedback cycle. So remember I said that oxytocin starts at low levels and increases by 3 to 4 times as labour towards the end of labour as far as we can measure. Well, the reason it increases is because there's a positive feedback cycle. I suggest you go to my blogs, epidurals, and you'll see a little picture of the positive feedback cycle. So I say that labour is like a snowball. It starts small, becomes bigger and bigger, and in the end becomes virtually unstoppable. And the reason for this is because instead of negative feedback cycles where high levels start body processes to bring it down, and oxytocin feedback cycle, high levels get the body to make them even higher. So and it depends on the sensations of labour. So basically this feedback cycle goes like this. So you get the sensations from the lower vagina and cervix, and they get fed back up to the brain by a specific nerve pathway, parasympathetic nerve pathway. When that information gets to the brain, it tells the brain to release more oxytocin. So the brain releases more oxytocin into the bloodstream to the uterus, stronger contractions, more sensations, more oxytocin. So you get this positive oxytocin feedback cycle, which just very helpfully also releases more oxytocin in the brain. So as the contraction gets stronger and more painful, you get more calming, pain-relieving effects. But this feedback cycle depends on the sensations. And the thing with epidurals is they're so effective at stopping the sensations. Basically, they slow down or even stop this feedback cycle. And as I'm finding in the research that I'm working on at the moment, oxytocin levels go down. They don't, instead of going up in labour, they plateau and they even go down towards the end of labour. So all of those advantages we're talking about, including the release in the brain, is not happening for a woman with an epidural. So it's a big hormonal gap. Yeah, it's pain relief, but it's a big hormonal gap.
Yeah, what you're saying there, and it's well known that epidurals slow down labour, and they often come with the administration of synthetic oxytocin to push that labour along.
Yes, exactly. And often those studies that are done on synthetic oxytocin haven't really taken account of epidurals, and we think that the more impactful intervention is not the synthetic oxytocin, it's actually the epidural. Because on the other hand, if you get synthetic oxytocin, labour becomes more painful, it overwhelms your own natural systems for dealing with that pain because it's not crossing into the brain, and then you need the epidural. So as you say, those two things go together quite commonly. And we think it's the epidural really that's having the most impact on the oxytocin system, causing the biggest hormonal gap.
So what can women do to optimise their oxytocin release in labour and really set them up for not just birth but also for the period afterwards?
Well, everything that you say, Tracy, everything you say on your website about how to set yourself up for the most physiological labour and birth. From my point of view, oxytocin has been called the hormone of trust. It's a hormone release when we feel safe. It's a hormone of sexual activity, right? So one of the things I say to women is when you're choosing whether to have a baby, you could say, is there somewhere where I could make a baby? Because it's really the same process, right? To feel private, safe and unobserved. So, and especially the early part of labour, when labour is getting established, and going back to my snowball analogy, you want to stay at home until the snowball is so big that it's unstoppable, and then move to hospital, so ideally have your own midwife, doula, some support at home to know when to move to hospital. So that's one thing. The model of care is so important, that you have someone that you can feel known by and private and safe with. None of our animals, none of our forebears ever gave birth with strangers, right? And we have this system where we're expected to go through this whole labor and birth and release oxytocin in this strange environment with strange people, right? That smells really weird and it's full of sick people that we might have even been to hospital, feeling unwell before. So it can have a bad, association with us. So very important to choose a model of care that's going to support your physiology. You can also support your physiology, especially in that transition to hospital. So often women find labouring at home is all going well, and especially if it's early in labour and labour isn't really established, i.e. the snowball isn't so big it's unstoppable and we move to hospital, then things can slow down or stop. So what you want to do at that point is to protect your senses, because that's what the limbic system is using to decide if it's safe or not. What you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you feel, right? So, an eye mask or protecting yourself from the visuals like earphones, music, hypnobirthing tapes, whatever works for you. Smell is very important, actually. It's very connected to the limbic system. So choosing what you smell, like taking your pillow to bury your head in, taking the T-shirt of someone you love to bury your head in, those kind of things to protect your system. So, and then, so those are all things that are going to help with physiological labour and birth. The other thing, as I said, is oxytocin is a hormone of making a baby as well as having a baby. So some women have actually used that in labour and birth. In fact, my friend Deborah Pascali-Bonaro, who did the film Orgasmic Birth, which I highly recommend, is looking at a specific vibrator to use in labour to increase your oxytocin, which is much more fun than like synthetic oxytocin, right? So, so sexual activity as well will help to speed labour in a natural way. But then again, if interventions are needed, and sometimes they are needed, sometimes it's necessary to save the life of the mother or the baby. Sometimes, epidurals will actually reduce stress to some extent. There is this short period where, when women have high stress, and sometimes high stress itself can inhibit labour. And then you get the epidural, and sometimes labour can actually start again because stress levels go down. But then the cycle is going to get impacted and your oxytocin level will go down eventually. But that first little bit can be a positive benefit of epidurals. But then, as I said, they're eventually going to impact your oxytocin cycle. So when that happens, basically, if you want to support your oxytocin cycle, what you want to do, and I'm talking about postpartum really, is your baby. Your baby is your oxytocin medicine, really. Skin to skin with your baby will release oxytocin, and as I mentioned, breastfeeding will release oxytocin. So particularly if you have a cesarean, you want to have skin to skin as soon as possible. There's certainly some, I don't know if anyone's doing it in Canberra, but in many places around the world, they're doing a natural, family-centered, different names for it, humanized cesarean, where the baby comes straight up on the mother's body, the baby's not separated at all. So that's the ideal. Skin to skin, delayed cord clamping, and you can hopefully request other things that you want with the cesarean, like having a quiet time so your baby hears your own voice first, having music played, things that are going to de-stress you as well. And if all of those things are not possible, then at least cheek to cheek, having some cheek to cheek contact with your baby will soothe you and soothe your baby as well. So, and just with skin to skin, I mean, again, going back to our 4 mothers in the wild, like there's nowhere else for the baby to be except skin to skin with the mother, maybe with another person at times, but there's no limit to skin to skin, and studies have shown that more skin to skin in the first month actually reduces the mother's postpartum depression score. And not only that, but improves the connection between mothers and babies up to 8 years old. That's a long-term follow-up. So skin to skin contact with your newborn, with your infant, you can get soft baby carriers where you can have their skin against their skin. That's a beautiful way of doing it. And then suckling, of course, I call breastfeeding Mother Nature's backup system. And just quoting one study here. So remember I said the personality changes depend on the peaks of oxytocin, and you don't get that with an epidural. So women with epidurals don't get those personality changes. But in this study, the women who went on to exclusively breastfeed for 4 to 6 months got those personality changes. So it's your backup system, not just for taking care of your baby, but for using, as I call Mother Nature's superb design, all those maternal adaptations that will help you to take care of your baby because it feels good, because your baby is rewarding to you. You want to kick that system in if you've had a hormonal gap in labour and birth.
Well said. Often women are very surprised that the baby doesn't want to be put down when they're born, and they've bought the prams and they've bought the carriers and things like that. But Sarah's point about, baby being on skin to skin is very, very traditional, and it's the way we've always protected our babies. So it makes total sense what you're describing there.
Now, and from an evolutionary point of view, Tracy, if we put our babies down and turned around, the baby wouldn't be there when we turned back. It'd be taken by a predator. Like a midwife who worked in Sudan told me snakes would take the babies in Sudan. Like you just wouldn't put your baby down. And if you put your baby somewhere else to sleep, it wouldn't be there in the morning, right? So our babies know this. They're hardwired through that 65 million years of mammalian evolution that this only safe place is in contact with a human.
Sarah, in your book, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering, you talk about ecstatic birth and orgasmic birth. And I'm glad you mentioned the word orgasm, because it's so important, I think, for women to realise that women can have orgasms in childbirth, and the hormone for labour is also the hormone for orgasm. And so what does that tell us about what does Mother Nature want us to do? Does she want us to have one child and think it's the worst thing in the world and never have a child again? No, actually, she wants us to keep wanting to have babies. And so this feel-good aspect to the hormone of oxytocin is something to think about and contemplate when it comes to appreciating the intricacy of the Mother Nature's blueprint for birth. Tell us a bit about orgasmic birth, Sarah. How common is it? How can women optimise that?
Well, I would say that every physiological birth is orgasmic, because you're going to get those peaks of oxytocin at the end, whether it feels like a sexual orgasm or not.
Yeah.
And you're going to have all of those like bonding, reward and pleasure center activation. All of those things are going to happen at the end of physiological labor and birth. So every physiological labor and birth is an orgasmic birth, I would say. Some women report that the experience feels like a sexual orgasm, but I also think our orgasmic potential is much wider than what we might see as a pattern for orgasm that's actually based on male orgasm, which is, a build up and then a peak and then a drop down. Women can be multi-orgasmic. We can be on plateaus. We can have orgasmic experiences that aren't necessarily that kind of single peak. So as I said, I think that's a great way to think of it. And, I guess I think that like intending to have an orgasmic birth or intending to have a pain-free birth might not be such a good way to go, because then you could be disappointed because, I had pain or I didn't have an orgasm, you know what I mean? But every physiological birth is filled with that to some extent, you can't get around that. And, also just appreciating that Mother Nature lines it all up, as you say, to make it as rewarding as possible, as I don't know if I can say the word enjoyable, but as rewarding as possible through that maximal activation. And that's what it's all about. And, in terms of pain, Mother Nature gives us all these pain relieving effects, and all of our foremothers across space and time have found their way to navigate that pain. And often, usually it's with people that you love who can support you, physical practices that I'm sure you teach as well, whatever works for you in labor. It might be being by yourself. It might be hot towels on your back. It might be, looking into your eyes, it would be beloved, telling them I love you, like I did with my last baby. That's what got me through that intense pain. So I think, orgasmic birth, I think every birth is orgasmic to some extent. And, whether there's pain or not, it's really, as I say, I think that the whole design of birth is really to put us into the state where pain is kind of just part of the process. It does put it into this altered state, or as one researcher, as a research colleague says, a flow state. Birth puts us into a flow state where pain is just part of the process. So, yeah, I know it's difficult when you're looking ahead at birth and you haven't had a baby and you've seen all these awful things on YouTube and TV, but really, birth is designed to ultimately feel good, to ultimately be rewarding. And the way that you can make the most of Mother Nature's superb design is to increase your chance of physiological birth, model of care, protecting your limbic system, and all of those things.
Yeah, beautiful. You've given us so much to think about today, and it just warms my heart to appreciate the full depth of experience that can come with birth, promoted by hormones, promoted by physiological processes that, even people like Sarah don't know and can get a grip on. Like, there's an intricacy and an age-old wisdom to our bodies, an intelligence to our bodies and our systems that are designed to prepare us for this next phase. I often laugh with families, say, have you ever looked at somebody else's newborn and thought, that's a funny looking little thing? And when people say it's different with your own, it truly is different with your own, because you're totally being primed to transform and be ready to fall in love and want to protect this baby forevermore. And that's the design. Sarah has a quote on her website called "Birth is always transformative." And I think it's really important we appreciate that, because sometimes the dialogue we have around birth is not really appreciating some of these more subtle, intricate aspects of priming the mother's body for birth, priming the baby for life outside the womb, priming their relationship together for a long time to come. Is there anything else you'd like to say to wrap up today, Sarah?
Just one more thing, Tracy, reflecting on what you said. I think that the processes of birth are so immense and so transformative, and so like it opens us up on this very vulnerable level, no matter how we give birth. And I think there's a big gap in our culture for honouring that, for protecting women in the postpartum period. You know, in some places like America, you're expected to go back to work at 6 weeks, right? So if you're planning this physiological birth or any kind of birth, right, I really recommend that you put some things into place to seclude yourself, to protect yourself, to get that support that traditional cultures offer, ideally for the first 40 days. But my rule of thumb is don't get out of your pajamas for at least a week.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very precious time. And I love to have these types of conversations and to put a bit of meat on the bones of what I've been teaching for a lot of years, for people to appreciate that, the hormones like oxytocin are very transformative and not to be underestimated. So thank you, everyone, for listening again. And we'll have more goodness for you next week. We've got another birth story for you next week. So tune in and have a great week. And thanks for listening. Thanks, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Tracy.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe and share this podcast. This episode has been brought to you by Transform Parenting, an organisation that provides courses, coaching and community from pregnancy through to the first 7 years of a child's life. It is a place where you can learn, get support and grow into your role as a parent. Why not take advantage of a special gift for all pregnant women at transformyourbirth.com.au? Or if you have children, we have a gift for parents also.